Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the latest episode of Growth's The Prism. It's a discussion panel where we basically address all aspects of all facets of leadership as they come through that prism. You have, one input and multiple outputs when you come to leadership a lot of times. And I think this is show 5 or 6. We've been on long enough that I'm starting to lose count.
Yeah.
But had a great time so far. We started with the attributes of great leaders during crisis and some of the attributes that get them through and let them rise to the top. We shifted that a little bit to the importance of trust and credibility prior to entering a crisis. It's very hard to establish it once you are in a crisis. So we talked about leadership traits in that space. And then we pivoted the last couple of weeks to things like pricing and strategy and the impact of pricing and predatory pricing versus market fairness pricing, and what's appropriate during a crisis. And should companies be allowed to leverage opportunities during a crisis, or is there this overwhelming social responsibility to always do the right thing? Do you override shareholder value during a crisis for the sake of the consumer and the greater good of the economy, et cetera, et cetera? That was a great discussion the last couple of weeks. So if you haven't seen those episodes, please go back to your favorite social media channel and check them out. A lot of interesting comments throughout the show. Excuse me. Today we are missing one of our panelists. Our chief revenue officer is off trying to generate some revenue, so he's excused today, and we'll be a panel of 3 for the time being. So we thought we'd kind of tag off of last week's conversation. We ended on a good note, but we still have this ethical dilemma. And you're the CEO of a company, almost any size company, but public companies probably more than private. And you got shareholder expectations based on their investment in your company. They expect a profit. They expect a healthy profit. They could expect annual dividends, et cetera, et cetera. You've got activist investors breathing down your neck all the time. They want you to do a certain thing. You got NGOs breathing down your neck that want to make sure you're doing the right thing from a social responsibility standpoint. And in some cases, you may even have your employees breathing down your neck to do the right thing. And it's incredibly high balance. And you can have a very strong moral compass. You can want to do all the right things for the greater good. You can if you're a pharma company, you may want to give away the cure, so to speak. But you report to shareholders, you report to board of directors, and they may not agree. They may say your obligation is to the shareholders and to return profits and to meet whatever ROI hurdles that company may have. So let's talk a little bit about how you balance that. And I know Jim Hotaling last week, you talked a lot about how important the narrative is. And I think Joe, you mentioned some things about having to balance. When you use that word balance again, doing the right thing for the greater good as well as doing the right thing for the company. Does anybody even think, is that balance possible? Or is America corporations so greed centric that it would be almost impossible for a CEO to create a balance? They always have to lean towards the greater good of the shareholders. What do you guys think?
I think the consumer has a little bit of a vote into it too, right? As you were talking, I was thinking about how far does the human with their own morals push things forward, and what do the stockholders, the shareholders, the boards, and the consumers, how do they rate that, right? And I think at some point maybe it levels out. I don't know how many, speaking maybe from a North American point of view, how many people just truly love cutthroat organizations and they're willing to have someone who's immoral run that organization. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a couple examples of where that is, where we all turn the other way just to have the profit or the good product. And I don't know. I think it always balances out at the end of the day.
It's interesting. I've got a ton of experience with publicly held companies, and obviously this particular crisis is unprecedented. But in general, CEO success is measured on either revenue growth or profit growth, depending on where that company is in their life cycle and what they're trying to achieve. And then there are expectations for what I'll call table stakes, that a company will do a good enough job with environmental and social responsibility, so they're not on the front page of a newspaper.
Yep.
that they'll do a good enough job with their corporate culture so they're not on the front page of a newspaper with any harassment issues or whistleblower or things like that. But rarely do I see a CEO who gets rewarded for moral compass, a strong moral compass first. It might be part of the decision process and it might be part of the debates with the board, but it almost always leads with revenue or profits when it comes to that reward system for the CEO. And in a crisis like this, particularly if you're a company that's contributing to the greater well-being, that's a really tough thing to balance. Should Jeff Bezos be doing free shipping for all? Should Jeff Bezos at Amazon be doing free shipping for all right now? Should that be his part? He's making billions of dollars. Should he just be shipping everything for free? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. If I'm Jeff and I'm looking at billions of dollars of freight charges, I'll probably say no. But there's probably some other people, even his own employees, that would say yes. So interesting dilemmas here.
I think it's a very interesting dilemma, and as it pertains to the COVID situation, I think we talked about this before, but just with the COVID situation and with employees' uncomfortableness going into work as states are opening up, I think we had discussed before. What is the CEO's responsibility in that regard? Is it to listen to every employee's complaint and make sure every employee is comfortable? Is it to make sure that they're just getting back to business to restore the revenue stream that they once had, which is not going to happen for a little while, obviously, unless you are an Amazon, who's I don't think the revenues have taken much of a hit at all. But the question just becomes, what do you do there? I mean, if you were running a company today, Mike, I mean, how would you handle that? I mean, how would you handle? Because everybody's going to have their own. Some people are chomping at the bit to get back to work, and others are still very, very nervous about the idea of going to work and being surrounded by others and potentially getting COVID. But how would you've ran and worked with large publicly traded companies? How would you handle that as a leader today in this day and age?
So I think it's situational. That's a great point, Joe, and it is situational, and I have a very high sensitivity to it. I happen to be one of those people with an underlying health condition that puts me at risk. So for me to go sit in an office and sit in a conference room and talk to a bunch of people would be very, very uncomfortable for me. And I'm not sure I'd be ready to do it at this point in time, even if I was the CEO of a company. So I'd probably be having some pretty interesting conversations with the board, whether my, risking my life was worth representing the company as their CEO. It could even get to that point. But I think as a sitting CEO who needs to reopen their business and needs to get things started again, you do have people that are chomping at the bit to get back to work. But what's interesting is they've done a lot of surveys in the last few weeks, and about 70 to 78%, depending on where you do the survey, aren't so anxious to leave their house. They would love to get back to work in a way, but not necessarily if it meant they were on the front lines and they were walking into a building every day and taking the chance of catching this virus. And so we've now shifted from a society that was focused on what we have to do. We've got to shelter in place, we've got to stay at home 2, 3, 4 weeks, and the virus is gone. That's what everybody thought. I thought that way back in the beginning of March. Hey, just hunker down for a few weeks, this thing will burn out and we'll all be good. We're now, 8 weeks later or more, at the realization that the virus isn't going away, that we're going to have to live with it, that we're going to have hotspots, that there will be people catching this, and there probably will be people catching this with underlying health conditions, and they're going to die. And as a CEO, this is unprecedented. Asking people to come back into your buildings to do a job, knowing that there's a chance some of them will die if they catch this virus, I don't know if any CEO's ever faced that before.
So, Mike, let's make it controversial.
Sure.
And so, if you're as the CEO, if you're taking all the known precautions that you could take, right, everything that the CDC is saying, this will now create a safe as can be environment. At what point are you at least telling your employees it's as safe as it can be, and we must conduct work? And I'll say this: is it still not per thousand more dangerous to drive on a highway if the highway was at full capacity? Is it more dangerous to be driving to work than it is the potential of dying from COVID? So when's
Today,
it stopped?
so right now, the answer to your question is it is far more dangerous to, in terms of catching COVID and dying than it would be driving to work. If you look at deaths per million of population, now not across the whole country. That's why I said this is very situational. If I'm sitting in Oklahoma or somewhere in the Midwest and even St. Louis, it's a very different conversation because the cases are so low. If you're in the Northeast corridor, your deaths are anywhere from 700 per million to 1,500 per million. That's a high number from medical terms. So it all comes down to you've got to do everything you can do, as you said, to make it safe. And you tell your employees, this is as safe as it can possibly be, using your words, but we can't make it 100% safe. So in your analogy, we've made it safe enough so it's a daily risk, just like driving to work, whatever. If you can get it to that point, it almost becomes a non-conversation after you have the first one, right? So I agree with you on that. I just think today we're not ready for that yet. I think 2 or 3 months from now, when all the buildings have been retrofitted, when there's new cleaning processes in place, when there's enough cleaning solutions to properly clean a workspace, when there's enough real masks for everybody to wear. The fallacy with the cloth mask is that they eliminate the risk of catching it. They only reduce it. It's not like an N95 mask with a pair of goggles. You wear a cloth mask, you got open eyes, you still run like a 1.5–2% chance of catching the virus. I don't think you run a 1.5–2% chance of dying in a car crash on the way to work. So right now, the odds, I don't feel, are in favor of any CEO pushing his people back to work, his or her people back to work. I think the CEO has to do everything in their power to create a work environment where people can work at home. Where they cannot work at home, then they've got to get hyper innovative on how they're going to protect that employee once they walk through that front door. The good news is we've had frontline employees, grocery workers, delivery people, et cetera, et cetera. If you go back and look at the numbers of people that got sick in those environments, even with the minimum protection that's happening, Stop and Shop finally provided people at the grocery store with their own masks, the cashiers. They put up a plexi shield. There was a supermarket chain in Texas that did a phenomenal job with social distancing and plexi shields and protecting their employees. So we haven't really seen big hotspots of people getting ill from the virus from the frontline workers, which is good news. It shows that if you do use some type of protective equipment, you can reduce the number. So I totally agree with you. At some point, you need to open the door and say, hey, we've done everything we can. What's going to be interesting is when that happens, like I said, it's not risk-free. Somebody will die. Mm-hmm. Somebody will choose to go to work, and they can even be a healthy 40-year-old that gets that blood clotting issue, or maybe it's a 61-year-old that has to work that last 2 or 3 years to get the Medicare and retire, and they're just not willing to, they can't afford to just sit at home. They need that job. But somebody will die. Then what happens? Is somebody dying going to be living with it, just like if somebody died in a car crash on the way to work, if somebody had a heart attack sitting in their office, et cetera, et cetera? Can somebody dying from COVID fit into those categories? Or is our wonderful U.S. legal system going to allow somebody who died from COVID who went into one of those buildings that was deemed safe to sue?
Yeah.
Now, does that change the dynamic?
That's a whole other topic. Yeah,
Yep.
I mean, I think that's a disaster. That'll be a disaster for companies. It'll be a disaster for leaders of companies. It'll be a disaster for our nation if people are allowed to sue, because we're already lawsuit happy, but that will be a whole different ballgame. And I think, I agree with you. I mean, Mike, to your point, if you have pre-existing conditions, it's an issue. And if you're the CEO of a company and folks have pre-existing conditions, you probably do want to make exceptions for those folks. But at some point here, we got to get back to the herd immunity side of things and just, if we don't, it's going to really keep capitulating. It's going to affect us, maybe in the fall, maybe early next year, what have you, when we do all get back to work. At some point, we kind of need to get back to, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, we kind of need to get back to life as we once knew it. And then people say we'll never get back to that point, but this won't be the last. This won't be the last disease that hits us, right? Whether it's N1H1, swine, what have you. There's always something, and I think the way of living that we're living today, or maybe it just changes the whole dynamic of our economy, right, moving forward. But I have to say, if I was running an organization today, I would, to your point, Mike, make sure I did everything I could to allow for people to work remotely. But there are certain situations in certain industries that you just can't. There's nothing you can do about it. You have to be at the manufacturing facilities, plants. You have to be there. Assembly lines, what have you, where they're not automated 100%. I don't see how you get around it. You look at Tyson's, you look at the food shortage, some of the food shortage issues that we're having. I can't see how that doesn't continue to become a problem if we don't find a way to get back to work, at least the healthy people. Because at some point, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Joe. So you're exactly right. You're right on the right path and spot on. And it comes down to something we talked about a few weeks ago, where how are people going to adapt? How are they going to pivot? How are they going to help themselves with their existing markets from a survive standpoint? And then how are they going to set themselves up to thrive strategically moving forward? Yep. And your example of Tyson, so they pulled everybody out of the plant. They had 4,000 people, I think 700 got sick, which is a big number. Yeah. They cleaned the whole plant. Now when you send everybody back to work, they got to go back to work with like Tyvek suits, gloves, face shield, not just a cloth mask, face shield to protect their whole face and eyes because they're working side by side with people. They also have available now, but once again, how do you get enough of them and how do you get them dispersed? But I've seen them used in pictures at hospitals. They have these booths you walk through, and you just walk into a room, it goes, sprays you down, and you walk out the other side, and you're disinfected. They need to have those at the meatpacking plants, people walking in, people walking out. We need to be able to test people every other day. Look at Major League Baseball, look at the NHL, look at the NBA, look at the NFL. They are literally talking about people getting tested every 2 days. So you need those tests where you get results in 2 hours. You get tested every 2 days. You keep people safe that way. Very, very much the new normal. I know we're going to get there. My biggest debate is today. I think we're jumping the gun. If we had all those things in place and we were truly ready for this and we said, okay, everybody put your face shield on, everybody do this, everybody go back to work, go to a restaurant and you got your own little greenhouse, we're good. But we're doing this before we're ready. And that's where I think CEOs are really, really going to start having some mental gymnastics because they want to win. They want everything to start back up again. They want to, win for their shareholders. They want to win for their employees. And they're sitting here saying, the economy's reopening, I'm bringing people back to work, and I'm not ready yet. So to your point, if you can check that box and say, we're ready for this, and you've done the best you could, I'm thumbs up. Where we are today, I'm really, really struggling with this because I want the economy as open as much as anybody else. I just don't think we're ready, at least not in the Northeast corridor.
Now, so this is interesting, and I hopped in for this one because I think it's easy to have this mentality as a CEO or someone who has the label executive on their name and above. You normally tend to be pretty decent off. But what happens when you're in the front lines and you come down the tier to your employees who literally go in another month without work can become life and death in another way. It may not be the virus, but now I don't have food or whatever it might be. So I think it gets to this dynamic. Then when do we start listening to the people who are like, cool, I'm ready to take the risk and go back to work because I need it. Some people need it even for their mental health. Like they're at the point that just being locked in their house is going to drive them crazy. So what do you do at that point? And I think this is the dynamic that we're facing now. And I know as we go further to the south and to the center of the country, there are many people even protesting that they want to get back to work. And I can see it both ways. And I know I'm in a larger city, so my perspective is a little bit biased when I see why do people want to go out. But then I also understand there are small towns that when you have a few thousand people, if you only had a handful of cases, why should I still have the same measures? You have, for example, Georgia, who's been open for about a week or a little longer already.
So keep the conversation going for me, Rue. And I want you to think about this theme and pull the thread and walk through it. So I keep hearing my body, my life. Get it. We're a free country. If you, Rue, decide that you want to go out and you're willing to take the risk, it's your choice, your body, your life. But with this virus, even though it's your body, your life, if you're asymptomatic, you're going to survive. You're not even going to know you had the virus unless somebody in your family catches it or a friend catches it from you or somebody with contact tracing comes and tests you and says, hey, you got the virus and you just gave it to 80 people. If you're giving it to other people and they're getting sick enough to go to the hospital or even die, is it still your body, your life? Because that decision you're making now affects a lot of other people.
So then
when
my
does it
question
stop?
is, if we're choosing to go out, because I'm viewing it from both perspective, and I'm gonna put like my devil's advocate cap, even though this is not the way I see it. But what if the way that I'm viewing it is I'm choosing to go outside. Everybody else who's also choosing to go outside is making the same decision I did and know the risk they're willing to take to expose themselves. And I think even from a business standpoint, what it may come down to is not saying we're open or close or we're starting or not starting. I think it's going to get to the point where we just have to give your employees the option to say you can start or not start. It's up to you whether you feel safe to do it or not do it. Because I think a lot of these decisions are going to come down to the individual level.
Do you fire the person that won't come to work?
No, you give them the option. And I think you may have to do, especially, and I think once again, if you have the ability to still allow them to work from home, possibly extend that for a longer period of time. But it's kind of, and at least in the Philadelphia area, we're seeing more and more businesses announcing that they're shutting down completely. They won't be reopening when this is over, because these 2 months of not having any income was all that it took. So another month of this is going to get even more drastic. And I understand we're like comparing life and the economy. But what happens if there is none at the end of this?
Well, you make a good point, Rue. Yeah, Brew, you make a good point, and I was going to bring that up. You know, at some point it has to weigh heavy on you that staying shut down is affecting. I mean, and it won't be measured for years to come, but the amount of suicides, the amount of abuse that's happening, spousal abuse, child abuse. There is a lot of really, really bad. You know, suicide rate has gone up. There's a lot of unintended consequences that are happening because of this. And to your point, Rue, right, you know, playing devil's advocate, it is, you know, well, one scenario is we risk people getting sick. The other scenario is, man, we're continuing to prolong this effect of whether people are going bankrupt, people are becoming suicidal, people are going crazy because they're stuck home, or they're taking it out on their children or spouse. There are so many other consequences and dominoes that are falling because of this. And I guess we won't know the total effect of others, and others who maybe didn't get diagnosed with cancer because they weren't able to be seen. They weren't able to get their elective procedures done. There are people who are scared to go to doctors, and maybe a woman who feels that she could have breast cancer is petrified to go to doctors and get tested because she doesn't want to be, you know, exposed. There are so many scenarios, and I think it's a really hard one to come across. But Brew, playing devil's advocate like yourself, same thing. I think about that as well. Is at what point do we just allow people to put their own lives in their own hands, and people who are at risk with pre-existing conditions would probably want to stay at home until a period of time where they feel comfortable. But others who are healthy, don't have any pre-existing conditions, are younger, give them the opportunity to get back and start doing what they want to do.
Yeah, so let's look at, you know, expand that conversation a little bit. So I don't think you're playing devil's advocate as much as you're stating some facts that are out there, right? You know, there is documented that domestic abuse has risen and child abuse, and we've got people that are suicidal. On the flip side, we also have a lot less crime in every city. So there's less shootings, there's less robberies, there's less armed battery, whatever you want to call it. We've got the ozone layer filling in. We've got the waters running clear in Venice, Italy. We've got pollution going away in China. We've got blue skies in India that haven't been there for 30 years. So there's give and take on each side of this. So what it really comes down to, I guess, it's almost like a military strategy session where you got to plan for casualties of war. This is a war. It's a war against an enemy we can't see. It's a war against an enemy that's very sneaky. And somebody's got to decide if the casualties of war numbers are okay. And I think at a federal level, that decision's been made. I think the Trump administration said a couple weeks ago when they were willing to reopen the economy, they knew that at that point, if they said do this, that the death numbers were not going to be 80,000 or less, which was the number predicted when everybody was going to stay at home until it was done. So now, even with some of the limited activity we've done, we're up to 90,000 deaths, and I think we're going to be at 180,000 by the end of the summer. And if we get a second wave this winter, that number will double again to 350. So somebody made a decision that 350,000 deaths is an acceptable casualty of war. And maybe that's an okay number. It's horrific from a loss of life and impact on family. But in the total context of an economy failing and going into a depression and all those things you talked about, Joe, all the bad things that happen in that environment, maybe the 350,000 is an acceptable loss. I can't personally say yes or no to that, but somebody is, because us reopening the economies tomorrow or next week or 2 weeks from now, by the end of 2020, we're going to be seeing lives lost in the 300,000 plus range. And realistically, we know we can't stay the way we are right now, because this will not go away. If we get the second wave this winter, we're going to be dealing with this till October of 2021. So we do have to figure out how to live with this. And for those of you who are saying, where did the October 21 date come from? I just looked at the vaccine trials and when I thought the trials would finish and how many months it would take to deploy a vaccine, etc. So to get everybody vaccinated, you're looking at the fall of 21. And at that point, maybe we have a mostly normal life. Everybody gets back again, but we got a long way to go. So I can absolutely appreciate the side that we can't do this any longer. We got to get moving. We got to get rolling. People are going to have to take the risk. People have to decide on their own whether they're willing to take that risk. It seems like there's a lot of people willing to do it. I'm really curious to see if all these people protesting with guns saying, you can't force me to stay home, if once the stay-at-home order is lifted, if all of a sudden they're just staying at home with their gun on their lap because they got what they wanted, but they don't really want to get out. They just want the ability to get out if they want to. So there's a lot of psychological things here. So I think everything you guys just said is awesome. Hey, Jim, why don't you chime in on this one? So I think what's holding us back right now, and Joe kind of alluded to it when he said people are afraid to go to their doctors and get cancer screening and stuff. Now, that's not going to change by reopening the economy. If anything, the risk may increase because cases are going to bounce and people may be more scared to go to the doctor. But anyways, we're now in a society that's based on fear. Right. And it's either fear of the virus that's driving actions, or it's lack of fear of the virus that's driving actions. You've been in some incredibly stressful situations in the military with teams and everything else. And as brave as all you guys are and all the wonderful things you've done for this country, there had to be moments where the team had fear, where you face just incredible odds or something like that. As a leader, how can you manage that fear culturally to help drive action?
So it's interesting. I keep going back to about controlling the narrative and all of those kind of things. And in the before I answer that directly, Mike, I think this overall conversation about when is it safe to go back and who's going to manage risk still comes down to the narrative. Because are you going to be screening for someone that has high blood pressure and not allow them to eat meat? Are you going to have, you know what I mean? Like when does it stop? Now that I think we've all agreed that if you control getting underneath the curve, if we can control that, at that point it becomes a narrative on when is it safe, when is it not, and you get to choose: is it COVID, is it cancer? If all of a sudden we said we are going to solve cancer by the end of next year and all hands on deck, and all of that. We could choose to do that, just like we're trying to say we're going to try to get this vaccine for COVID. So it's controlling the narrative. Back to your point on the question. It's the same thing. You're absolutely right. Everybody has fear. It's a natural human reaction. And if you don't have it, you actually aren't having your head in the game. But it is about controlling the narrative. So one thing that I think would be important is that from a national perspective, I believe the average American has a fairly low sense of resiliency. I think they have just a fairly low, we're kind of, we live very good lives in America. And so our resilience is a little bit lower when you have high crisis, high stress environments like what we're under right now. So it'd be interesting to see if,
Are you saying we become a bunch of candy asses? Is that what we're trying to say here?
I think the Americans are still, I still think we are very strong, but we have become softer. There's no doubt about that. And it would be interesting if, from a national perspective, and even in private industry, if we could start building resilient messaging, if we could start getting people to think about what it takes to be, as a society, what it takes to have a resilient mindset going into this, could help quite a bit. So there's a lot of being thankful for our frontline workers, and there's a lot of inspirational private industry messages that are out on TV and on radio every day that I'm proud to watch, and all of those things. But I think there could be a little bit more of a sharper focus on resilience and starting to subliminally educate the American public, or the worldwide public for that matter, on how to become resilient and how to start to learn to deal with stress and how to accept fear for what it is, but understand it more. And I think you could do that, not into like this crazy mass education kind of thing, but I think with some pretty high impactful messaging, you could start to get people to take that first step of lowering the fear that just paralyzes them.
So I've heard a lot of push or recommendations that the U.S. and even the world needs to stop reporting cases and deaths on a daily basis. Maybe a shift to a monthly basis or something like that, because there's constant, opening up word a meter and 100 people died today, 1,000 people died today, 10,000 people died today. There were 10,000 new cases today. Just feeds the fear.
Yep.
Is it okay to stop showing those numbers, or do you feel like it's the obligation of the government to continue to publish them? I know we don't have to look at them if we don't want to, but.
I think that's it. I think it is the obligation to have them there. You got to have high transparency. You must have that, because then it opens up a can of worms if you don't. However, you read anything on resilience, and they all talk about one of the very first things any person should do is stop looking at the news every single day, or stop listening. Because of how this shapes your mental attitude. So yeah, I think it is not healthy for people to be focused on those. And guess what? I'm guilty as charged also, because the news app that I have, when I open it in the morning with my cup of coffee, it by default, the very first thing is the ticker.
Yep.
That's not healthy. No. It's not healthy. Because again, choose the narrative. Because let's say it was a non-COVID event. If you had deaths by DUI on that every single day, guess what would be some of the most important things throughout the entire nation right now would be DUIs, or pick a thing.
Pick anything. Right.
And if that ticker was constantly going, it would be on the narrative. It would be what we're talking about and thinking about and paralyzed about.
Yeah, I looked it up. Statistically, on an average year, about 7,000, give or take, people die per day in America from everything. Car accidents, cancer, heart attack, whatever. So we got about 7,000 people dying a day organically that have always happened. COVID to date has averaged about 4,000 against that. So it's a pretty, it's absolutely the number one killer. And it's increased the daily deaths by about 75%. So it's a pretty big number. Now, that number should go down over time to hopefully get to the point where it's 20% of total daily deaths. And it should get low enough at some point where it's not worth reporting, because it's just another, statistic in that total daily death number, and it's not as statistically relevant as it is today. But getting back to that fear factor, so Joe, what recommendations, if any, do you have on what people can do and what other things they can focus on that will start reducing that fear? How do you start looking at some of the silver linings here instead of just focusing on daily cases, daily deaths?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I forget who, but one of you were talking a little bit ago about, I think it was Jim, about, the fear mongering that's going on, right? So there's so much fear being instilled in everybody with reporting daily, right? And hourly, it's nonstop. So I do think that information needs to be there, but maybe you need to go look it up versus it being pushed in front of your face all the time. But the other thing too is what I'm to this day still confused about is why they actually don't talk about, why isn't the media or why isn't the government, why aren't they talking about some of the things that we should be doing to keep ourselves healthy? In other words, what kind of vitamins, the C, vitamin C, zinc, what have you, but doing the right things to keep yourself, if you're exercising at home, if you're taking vitamins, etc., where your chances of getting sick are severely diminished, why aren't they talking about those kinds of things? About getting healthy, about staying healthy, about being healthy, about eating healthy, taking vitamins, etc. I think we lose sight of the things that could help us versus the things just to be scared of. And I think that's an area that we should be focused on. My wife, God bless her, she's on the front line. So she works in a hospital, she's a PA, she's working with COVID patients. And she has a protocol when she gets home and does certain things. She has change her clothes in the garage. She gets changed, comes in, immediately showers before she even hugs the kids and all that fun stuff. But we take probably too many vitamins. But none of us have gotten sick. None of us have even sniffed anything about it. And if we have, maybe we've had it. It's just been asymptomatic. I don't know. Nonetheless, I feel that there needs to be an education on. And Jim, you said there doesn't need to be a mass education on formalized education, but I think speaking at least to vitamins, health, etc. I don't think, in my gut, I don't think that we'll ever find a vaccination for this. I think it's wishful thinking that we're going to have a vaccination that's going to completely clear us. I think before the vaccination is out, maybe this thing has, with herd immunity, maybe it diminishes more. But I think if people just understood, hey, you run the risk, but if you do this, your risks are different. Back to what we were saying before, cancer. Cancer is one of the number one killers. If you make the decision that you want to smoke every day, you're making a decision to do that. If you want to make a decision to be healthy, not smoke, not drink, not whatever, you want to eat healthy, you don't want to get diabetes, then you do certain things not to succumb to some of those diseases that you actually have a chance to reduce. I think this is one of those things that we just need to focus on some of the things that we can do to limit the risk of getting it. There's nothing that's going to be bulletproof, obviously, but I think an education there should be had.
Well, I'm one of those guys that believe in science, and I think there's enough people working on vaccines. We will end up with something, and how effective it'll be will end up being debatable.
Yeah,
there's just too many good things happening with some of the recombinant DNA and the other things they're looking at, that there'll be something that helps. We can't guarantee it's going to be 100% preventative, but they'll definitely find something that helps. And there's just too much money being thrown at it and too much science, and this isn't quite as complicated as cancer in terms of getting vaccines for viruses. And we're going to have to keep getting better and better, because this isn't going to be the first super virus we're going to have to face at this point. I think they're going to keep coming at us, and we're going to have to deal with that. But in terms of the human beings and just reducing the stress and the fear factor, and you look on Facebook and some of your friends on there and some of the innovative things they've done. And one of my friends, husband, wife, only child at home, he's like 11, I think. They did the COVID Olympics at their house. They set up all these different mini Olympic events, and it could be everything from Olympic toy bowling to basketball, whatever. But they had a whole week of all these Olympics and obstacle courses outside in the backyard.
Yeah.
So there's things you can do like that. Unfortunately, I think too many people have focused on COVID stress relief with food. And, there's all kinds of food stuff on there, and people are snacking like crazy, et cetera, et cetera. So, they're going to have to find a way to get healthier in that respect. And you got to be careful with diabetes, adult diabetes, and things like that there. But the people have been creative. The people who found things to go at home, do at home. People have made up their own little jingles and songs and perform on Facebook to reduce stress and stuff like that's pretty cool. And I think some of that's going to have to somehow transfer to the workplace, where you can't walk into a building and have it be a morgue where you can feel the fear hanging in the air.
Absolutely
and,
correct. That's right.
You know, it's got to be bright lights. It's got to be spit shined and polished, and you got to instantly see that the office desks have been spaced apart properly. You got to see cleaning people all over the place. You know, you got to be tested walking in the door, et cetera, et cetera. These corporations have to create that sense of confidence, and they have to reduce that fear factor as people walk through the door.
Yeah,
Jim, go ahead.
now, like no matter where you work in today's world, it is going to be the individual's risk management and risk tolerance. There's no doubt about it. But if you look at someone who's an Alaska fisherman, that's a high risk environment, but they choose to be the fisherman. However, they know that there's a life raft on board. They know that there's a survival suit. They know that they have beacons, all of those things. So to your point, Mike, I think that is an obligation of an organization to make sure they have these symbols of, you know, we are making this as safe as can be. And there's kind of like this moral contract of you're making individual risk management, risk assessments to come to work. You have that, and we will provide the fact that there's bright lights, clean places, spaced apart. I think we get to that, we're moving forward.
Yep. And you look at countries already adapting. Just to give real time, I read this morning in the paper, and I try to find good news in the paper all the time. There's too much bad news and too much fake news, so I try to find some of the good news stories. So Iceland, one of my favorite countries in all the world, they've done a pretty good job eliminating the virus. It's not 100% gone, but it's really low. They've got their own contact tracing app that all the Irish citizens have to have on their phones. And they've offered tourism to the world again, starting in the middle of June, I think. If you fly into Iceland, you're going to get off the plane. They're going to test you. You're going to go to your hotel, and within 2 hours, you'll have the results of your test. If you're negative, you're free to tour Iceland. If you're positive, you've got to stay in that hotel for 2 weeks, or you got to get out. You got to go back to where you came from. That'd be your choice. But they've come up with a way that if you feel like you're healthy and you want to take that risk, you fly to Iceland, they test you when you land. If you're negative, you've got a vacation you can take. And with the number of cases in Iceland, that's fairly safe, particularly if you stay social distancing and do the other things that you want to do. They've already said they've limited the number of people in the tour buses. The tour buses they have there sit, I think most of the ones that can go off-road, about 16 people.
Yeah.
They said they're only going to put 4 to 6 people in a tour bus, so you can sit every other row. Everybody wears masks on the tour bus. So people are adapting. They're trying to get there. They're trying to do the right thing. They showed a restaurant in Amsterdam right on the canal, and they set up dinner tables right along the canal. And each dinner table had their own greenhouse.
Yep.
And they served them inside their greenhouse so they were protected. People are adapting. Yep. So I do think that fear level will dissipate as time goes on, and the numbers are going to continue to get lower, and this will be something that if somebody chooses to look at the numbers, they can go find them. And I'm hoping we get to the place where it's not the headline every day. The Boston Globe, the number of deaths and the number of new cases and the graph of total cases, total deaths is the right-hand corner of the front page every single morning. That's what's there. The left-hand corner of the front page is another article about something else bad happening. And you got to go to like page 7 to hit the good stuff. Yeah. So bad news gets more clicks, and that's what the news media leads with. But so if we can get people comfortable with moving around, number one, get them comfortable with visiting businesses, number two, and then get them comfortable being in the business, number three. That might be number two before the people visit. But you have to be able to walk in the door at work and feel safe. Not risk-free, safe. And those are two different words. Safe doesn't mean 100% risk-free. Safe just means, in relative terms, I feel safe. We've got to get to that point with businesses, and that's a big obligation for the CEO, and it's a big investment for the company. And governor of Massachusetts has already said the state cannot afford to do perpetual testing. It's almost $1 million a month to do perpetual testing. And if you wanted to do perpetual testing at a level that would guarantee the safe we're talking about, Jim, I think it was like 64 million a year or something just to do that. It was just some huge number. So the businesses are going to have to start picking up some of the costs of this testing. They're going to have tests available for their employees as they walk in the door, and look at the Major League Baseball model, things like that, Major League Soccer, where they're going to be testing athletes every 2 days. Any other final comments on this? It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, good conversation.
No, I have nothing. I would just say that the perpetual testing. To your point, Mike, it's I wonder how much that will cost. I'm wondering what the cost implication will be for companies, especially large organizations that have to implement all these different protocols. Whether it be you walk in and getting sprayed, whether it be the constant disinfection, the lighting, whatever case may be. I just wonder when they do a cost-benefit analysis of doing that perpetually versus maybe putting a better infrastructure in place to work remotely, which one is I guess more beneficial from a bottom line perspective. I don't know.
So I'm going to put on my David Mock hat. David was our guest speaker or the guest panelist the last couple of weeks, and he's a pricing expert, to say the least, and we talked a lot about pricing during a crisis. Mm-hmm. If a company came back and they said to the world, their customers, their market, that, hey, we have to raise prices, pick a number, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10%. We're only raising them to cover the cost of protecting our employees. Our testing every 2 days is costing us $180 an employee per week, and providing PPE is costing us $80 per employee per week. We took that, we amortized it against the cost of our product. So we're not trying to price gouge, we're not trying to make more money. All we're trying to do is keep our employees safe, and we're asking you to help us get there. I think you could get away with that. I think it would be okay. I think David would agree with that.
Yeah, I think that is a part of the new normal definition, right? You're going to see a COVID surcharge on your check at the restaurants and all of those kind of things, and that is going to be the cost of if you want to go out to the restaurant and you want to feel safe, that these charges are going to be built into that.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's good. There will be a new normal. It's going to be very, there's restaurants going bankrupt right now. There's different businesses, but at the same time, the stock market is still at 24,000 on the Dow because there is an incredible amount of liquidity out there, and there's no place else to put the money. So what you're going to see over time is all that liquidity is going to come back in to rebuy some of these businesses that went under. So it's unfortunate for the business owners today that, incredibly bad luck, bad timing, whatever you want to call it. But there will be people lined up to repurchase some of these businesses that are going under as far, once this starts recovering. And so it's an odd phenomenon, but you are going to see it happen. There's a ton of liquidity out there right now, a lot of investment dollars.
Amen.
All right, Jim, any words of wisdom? Anything for us to close this on? Want to do a plug for Iron Sharpens Iron? We still got minutes left. You can do that.
Yeah, sure. No, like if these type of conversations interest you, we do run a podcast that is a new podcast is put out every Tuesday on all the platforms that you would ever find a podcast on. It's called the Iron Sharpens Iron movement. And that phrase is really intended to almost match what we do here. So it's one person having an idea that shares with other people's. It's critical thinking. It's forging, pushing others' boundaries, all of that stuff. There's just fascinating guests. The last podcast that I just recorded that'll be coming out soon was with the Vice President of Franklin Covey, and just some very fascinating concepts on what really human-centric leading is all about. And if we kind of get to these human skills, not only in leading, but if we talked about today, resilience, these are the type of things that make us all better. So the podcast really deep dives into that.
Yeah, it's just an awesome take, and Jim's been great interviewing his guests, and he's had some very interesting guests on the show. So I invite you all to take a look. I think you get hooked pretty quickly. And in terms of end of growth, live webcast, and this is our Monday edition with the Prism, and it's 11 o'clock every Monday live. And End of Growth also hosts other discussion panels with other panelists all week long on Monday through Friday, including us. There's the director's chair, there's the elephant in the room, etc. So please jump on your favorite social media platform at 11 a.m. on any day of the week, and you'll find us out there with some really interesting conversation. And thank you all for joining us today. Great conversation to my team, and great being here once again. See you all next week.
Take care.